And now I have the great privilege of moving to our second keynote of our conference here, a man who really needs no introduction, but I'm going to try anyway, which is Professor Paul Maharg. He is Distinguished Professor of Practice at Osgoode Hall Law School in Canada and also with links with Newcastle University in England. Honorary Professor of the ANU, has been the Director of the Professional Education and Regulation in Law Centre. He is such a long-standing friend and leader of BILETA, as can be proved, because he won BILETA Trivia last night, for those who were at the dinner, by being able to identify the earliest conference any of us could remember. So Paul, we're very honoured to welcome you as ever to hear what you're going to say. The floor is yours, and hopefully we will manage to find your slides.
Thanks very much, Abby. Let's see if I can share the screen.
We should just be share screen.
Yeah. Yeah, and thank you very much to Abby and James and BILETA for the invitation to speak at BILETA. It's a super organisation. I'll be saying some words about it towards the end. But first of all, I want to talk about creative legal learning. James's theme is really quite riveting. The way in the sessions yesterday, people were taking it up much more than one usually does with conference themes. What I would like to do is to basically talk to some slides, and you can download these slides from slideshare.net, Paul Maharg, or you can follow them at paulmaharg.com/slides if you want to look at the slides on your devices. So what are we going to be talking about? Well, firstly, the whole idea of disremembering, which I think is really important for our discipline, and I'll say why in a moment or two. We'll look at three very short case studies spanning from kind of late medieval period through the Renaissance and into the early 21st century. And then also we'll be looking at creative legal education and how that can spin out of disremembering in a number of ways. And so we'll be looking at, first of all, the not so good news in the most recent ALT, that's the Association of Law Technologists, not the Association of Law Teachers, and their report. And then I'll be taking an example from a distillery, which is just a couple of minutes walk from where we live in Skye. And that example I have called distilling legal education. So, you know, forget about delivery vans and delivering the curriculum. You need a bottle of whiskey, you know. SCI, finally, the Simulated Client Initiative, we'll be looking at that as an example of creativity as well. And finally, some ideas on sustaining creativity. One of the points that I'd like to make to begin with, though, is that as Peter Goodrich in his super book, Law in the Courts of Love, has it, a critical jurisprudence must confront law's amnesia and endeavour thereby to read the unconscious body of law. So it's law's amnesia that I'm really kind of concerned about, and also legal education's amnesia. And I think that while we forget a lot about legal education, sometimes that forgetting, as Peter says, can be quite a positive thing. And I want to kind of explore how that might be. First of all, some definitions, some very loose definitions about disremembering. Disremembering is a word, it's in the OED, but in there it's defined as obviously forgetting, but in some circumstances, particularly its use in Ireland, it's a special kind of not remembering. It's kind of like having a hazy recollection of something. So you kind of know it, but you don't really know it clearly. Good examples of entire books that are written around that is Simon Schama's rather conservative view of landscape and memory, but beautifully written, a massive tour de force in so many ways. And also Gary Beener, and his latest study of the 1798 Irish Rebellion, and how that was interpreted, reinterpreted, repressed, and so on by unionist communities in the 19th century in Ireland. Fascinating book, looking again at this idea of disremembering and how effective it is, effective, and also how it can be used to so many different purposes, some of which are in the next paragraph here: creations, recreations, displacements, repressions, and so on. And as for creativity, I think I want to take as wide a view as possible of that. And I can come up with no better definition than supplied by James. James, where is he? Is he just gone out? Nah. Which is in his book on creativity, making things, whether it's due to necessity or whether we're doing it for enjoyment or indeed artistic purposes. So case one, first of all, and Zabarella. And I want to kind of give you something of the quick background here to Zabarella's life and also the texts that he worked with, because of course we're talking about 14th century here, so we're talking pre-print, and students are using manuscripts all the time to help them learn law in universities, particularly in Northern Italy, in Paris, and so on. So when you're actually creating a text such as you have here, then you are creating something that is an intensely sophisticated tool for learning. Contrast that with the late antiquity text that is just above it there from the Codex Sinaiticus. And that text, as it were, is written in what's called scriptio continua. So there are no spaces between the words, and there are no indices. There are no ways in which you can index the text at all. It's just straightforward text like that. Whereas in the 14th century example, which is taken from the Institutes of Justinian, we have a number of different levels of information. So in the center, as it were, we have what's called the textura. Notice the page is divided into two parts there, left and right, kind of like recto verso. And here we have the textura, Justinian's text. And around it, we have the gloss or the glossa. And then another level, here in the margins, we have the learner's glosses as well. So very often these, when these manuscripts were rented by students from the university stationer, they would have much larger margins. Students, if they had a lot of money, could buy these texts as well, and they would annotate the texts themselves in the margins. But in addition, we've also got another level, because these manuscripts were used in the lectures where the lecturer was giving their view of the gloss upon Justinian's text. So we have at least 4 levels of learning there, incredibly sophisticated when you actually think about it, and needs a lot of thought in order to think about who is saying what about what in the lecture theatre. And this gloss here is not fixed. It looks as if it's fixed, but very often the gloss itself was constantly moving until a wonderful scholar called Accursius produced what was called the Great Gloss, which was kind of like the fixed gloss, as it were, upon which there were tweakings, but that was more or less the kind of standard interpretation of Justinian's text. How did they navigate a text like this? Well, the glossators, I would argue, were technologists, because they are using all of these techniques here, which the late antiquity text didn't have at all. So in other words, as Parks points out here, all of the late medieval books, kind of paratextual devices, for annotating information, for cross-referencing information, which later became the basis, the infrastructure of the printed book. They were all created by the glossators, who were trying desperately to handle the information overload that was coming to them through this huge amount of canon law, and also from the enormous great texts, only 2 of them in Northern Europe at this time, of Justinian's Digest. And all of this are what I would call textual protocols. And I'll come back to that phrase in a moment. But first of all, Franciscus Zabarella, our case study here, he was a quite remarkable person in many ways. He studied law. He was not a cleric, but he actually ended up as a cardinal. And he was used on diplomatic missions. He spent 25 years teaching canon law in Padua and Florence. Respected as a negotiator, political arbiter, the Great Schism, when there were 2 popes in the Catholic Church. He was one of the arbiters to try and mediate between the 2 of them in this huge theological crisis that the church was facing. And he was loved as a teacher. And there's this lovely story here of him being asked to go to on an embassy to the Duke of Savoy, and the students not allowing him to go. They did not want him to leave. You know, and I would say, when did that last happen to you as a teacher? You know, certainly hasn't happened to me. But he wrote numerous tracts as well. So he was a scholar as well as a professional lawyer. And one of them is a remarkable text on how to teach law and how to use these glosses as well with the students. And in many respects, what you've got is a commentary on the psychology of learning. So he talks to staff. How are you going to use that in the lecture theatre? He also talks to the students. What is it like to learn in this lecture theatre, in this environment, in this space? How are you supposed to live your life as a student? You know, what can you eat? What are you best to drink? How are you going to be surviving as a student? And above all, and this is really interesting, he talks about mediating understanding of text, law, and society, because he was at that apex, that matrix himself, as it were, in all his works. And I think that if we don't remember people like Zabarella, we do ourselves a disservice as law teachers. We ought to be kind of like recuperating figures such as him. Case study 2. Professor Heems goes to print, and I'll let you read this because this is taken from the late Lisa Jardin's book, and it's a quite remarkable read. We are now fast forwarding about 200 years, and we are into the print era, Renaissance print era. Okay. This is what Martin says in his letter.
So while we're reading, can we all remember to mute, please? Not people. Everybody online.
This is a fascinating moment because here we have one of the first instances in what later became the Netherlands of a law professor switching from manuscript into print. And here are the reasons set out by Martens, the printer, that how it happened and why it happened as well. What I find really fascinating about this, though, is just how, in terms of the students, we have a significant change of circumstance there for them. First of all, we have legal education as the intimate privileged circle in Heem's house, not the university. But then we have printers like Martens who are disintermediating university stationers, suddenly all those scribes who were scribing out the manuscripts, they've lost their jobs effectively. As the university moves over, slow process, but as they move over to book learning rather than manuscript learning. But what I'm really interested in is the mediation of the student's text into a printed book, because it was the students who provided the notes that persuaded Heames, I've got something here, because it wasn't the usual kind of text that Heames was familiar with, and he decided to do something with the students' notes, which is quite remarkable, because of course the students had erased. We don't hear about the students anymore, but it was their work in kind of summarizing Heames's seminars, his lectures, and so on, that provided the text for Martin's commercial profit in the end. And in that one moment, we can see the germ of the relationships which subsist to this day. And we ought to remember that, and also remember how it came out of a student community, as it were. Also, Heames switches technology from gloss and summa to print, but he's no longer in control. He has given the control to the printer. He doesn't get any money for that because he thinks it beneath him to ask for payment from a mere printer. This is not what professors do, you know. And what we have also are students not being compensated at all. Instead, students become ever more the consumers who are forced to buy the books, or in some other way to get access to them. And I would argue that we're undergoing just as crucial shifts in our technology, and that if we remember moments like that, we can understand what we're actually going through, and also how printers, publishers nowadays, are changing very, very fast their commercial models. One of the reasons why open access is really so crucial to us in everything that we do as academics, because publishers are becoming ever more powerful in the sphere of learning and technology in our universities. We see that with publishers such as Elsevier, the way that they rack up the costs of making knowledge available to us in our university libraries, the desperate situations that many university law libraries are in as a result of that. So what was BILETA's response to all of this? Well, especially the new technology, they produced three really interesting early reports, 1991, 96, and then 2005. And we can get a sense of what these reports were about. The first one was rather, it's got a rather academic title to it, Inquiry into the Provision, you know. So it was a wee bit uncertain about that. It was there primarily to basically give law schools the power to ask for more funds in order to boost their technological provision within the law school, especially as there were a number of fascinating developments going on in the USA with Chicago Kent and LexisNexis becoming much more established, and legal databases and so on. In 1996, that becomes much more established as a report. And then the report, which was due to come out 5 years after 96, was delayed, came out as a survey of law schools later. But I would say, why haven't we continued this early tradition? Because there was a whole lot of data there, really fascinating stuff, which if it had been continued, we would have had almost like a kind of historiographical view of technology in our law schools as it develops. But instead, it stopped. In part because BILETA didn't have a report series publication platform. So as you can see, UKCLE and then Warwick, and then two academics publishing and the law teacher were how it put all that data out. But there are other things there. What report genre, and I'll come back to this later with ALT, do we want for our discipline? Because our discipline is different from chemistry, fine art, history, whatever in the university. And also, I think we should be looking at how other disciplines and professions use technology, for example, medical education. And there are general points here about these 3 case studies that we can come to as well. These graphics here are webcasts that some of us put together and designed from about 2002 to, this is Strathclyde, and then this one 2012. So over the course of a decade there. But I would argue that...
No, but my session's going to start at 1.
I would argue that basically... Sorry? Am I muted?
Mute everybody.
Participants be out there.
Oh yeah, sorry. Brilliant.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. I would argue that Richard Mayer's multimedia principles, which are kind of like the foundation of a lot of multimedia learning, those of coherence, signaling, redundancy, and so on that are listed there, are actually very, very usefully illustrated by the glossed manuscript here. And that in lots of ways, what we were doing in the webcast was rediscovering not only Mayer's multimedia principles, but how useful this was as a model for multimedia learning. In other words, we were taking a creative swerve around the book and back to the manuscript. And in many respects, I think what we're doing when we're being most creative in our teaching and learning is doing just that. And also, because remember I said that the manuscript was in a sense a set of protocols that the glossators were engaged in. We must never forget those invisible protocols that shape our digital interface and the history of that, going right back to the 1970s with CAN and SERF. These references are at the end. So if you're downloading the slides or looking at them, you can check them there. And of course, Berners-Lee with the World Wide Web, peer-to-peer, and also blockchain. We heard about blockchain yesterday, certainly in the session that I was in, really fascinating uses of it. And we can see examples of it in education at these links here, and particularly in this policy report here, blockchain in education. But to go further, because this is about research as well, it's not just about kind of practice of legal education and using applications. The problem is that just like the BILETA reports ended early, we have very little memory of technology in legal education ourselves in any jurisdiction. No histories, one bibliography from the USA, which went through 2 editions. The latest one in 2008, I think, Pearl Goldman's annotated work, really an excellent piece of scholarship. No collective statements, no policy papers, no map of interdisciplinary collaborations, no meta reviews. Few discourse analyses of the field. We have the 3 BILETA reports, and we've got 1 systematic review published by myself and Emma Nicol from Strathclyde on simulation, looking at simulation and technology in the last 40 years in a number of jurisdictions. And if you compare that with what, for example, medical education do, there is virtually no comparison in terms of the depth and the range and the sophistication of the research tools that are out there. So that, for example, if I'm interested in, say, how an OSCE, an objective structured clinical exam is held in, for example, surgery, maybe with 10 stations or something like that, then I can look up, I don't have to read about 300 original articles. I can go to the meta reviews or the research summaries and find out what the research actually is on those educational techniques. Cochrane collaboration is a really good example of that there. And it's also true of legal services in the profession. I was part of a review called Letter Legal Education Training Review way back in 2013. I was in charge of the literature review. We collected over 2,000 references on England and Wales legal education within the last 40 years. So going back to kind of like the Ormrod report in the 1970s. We put that on Zotero, open source, and we asked the regulators to update that and to do it regularly. Did they do that? No. A chance missed there. We had a platform, we had a cutoff point, and we could have built on that. But once again, it was missed. We can see it happening elsewhere. US IBA President's Task Force on the Future of Legal Education Services, great piece of work there, but it's snapshot research, you know? It's like there, and it's gone. It's gone. And we're not using these pieces of work for nearly enough in terms of longitudinal research. Okay, generating creative legal education. Well, first of all, the not so good news, ALT. What is ALT telling us about how we use technology just now? Well, we had, this is a regular report that they give, and remember this in the middle of the pandemic, 217 responses, 90% members of ALT, and at first glance, it looks pretty good. Student engagement, #1 driver for the use of technology, blended and hybrid, shift in practice, away from relying on Teams and Zoom. Yeah, okay, yeah, I'll go with that, especially Teams, and video collaboration and so on. But it's still well up there. We're still using these kind of VLEs. We're not using anything especially creative on the whole. And if we look at how important have these methods been to your work in the past year for those 217 responses, then we see that collaborative tools are up there. But I wonder, what are people doing with these collaborative tools? Or are they using them just as kind of like stores, delivery vans for, you know, for yet more information to get to the information to the students in the pandemic? But if we go to this point, this cutoff point here, which is quite considerable, lecture capture tools, 51%, but media production, much more creative, surely, is way down at 30%. So in other words, we're using technology to do what we did pre-COVID, and basically to do as much of that as possible. We're looking back all the time. And what's worse is that things like augmented reality are down here, game-based playing. And there's other stuff there that don't even make it onto this, like AI in legal education, or machine learning in legal education as well. I would much rather that whole thing were inverted, so that we had the bottom 6, for example, up there at the top, and people using those creative technologies much more. And that would be a real shift for me in terms of creativity. Here's another example of creativity. This is a castle, the remains of a castle on Skye, a place called the Castle Camus, the castle on the bay. This is what it looked like when it was built in the 15th century. Just a few minutes walk from where we are. What happened to all that stone though? Because the castle around the 17th century fell into ruin, and pretty substantial ruin at that. Well, in the early 19th century, the local laird used all that stone to build what is probably the finest set of barns, stables, and byres for his farm in the whole of Skye, and there it is there. So all that stone was used for that. But in addition, he also had the grounds around the castle, which was effectively a dun, an Iron Age fort. Pictish, so we're talking about maybe 8th, 9th century and so on. Torvig itself is a Viking word, so there's Viking invasions in the place as well. We've got Pictish then, Viking, Gaelic, Scottish. And then, of course, along in the 21st century, along comes Ian Noble, with a merchant banker in Edinburgh with lots of money to spend on Skye. He's passionate about Gaelic culture, and he founds a distillery there. He dies before he can develop the idea, which is developed by an independent bottler called Mossburn. And Mossburn effectively take on the difficult design challenge of fitting huge washbacks and the copper stills and so on into a listed building, which they do successfully, and they start producing whiskey. But they do something really interesting. What they do is they begin to think about what they call the Journeyman Project. They employ 9 distillers, which is incredible for a distillery. And these 9 have control over the full distillation process for 4 to 6 weeks annually. And what they're doing effectively is each of them are they're learning from each other, but they're creating changes in the distilling process to create new whiskey in so many ways. And what they can change is barley varieties, yeasts, fermentation lengths, parts per million of grain phenol levels, which affects the taste. And they are going to be released over time. A fascinating longitudinal project, that, because it's experimentation that's creative, sustainable, beside the usual product of the 10 and 12-year-old single malts that Torvig produces. But they're also, in that longitudinal project, they're tracking what's happening as well. They're making sure that the whole process is logged, so they know what works and why. It's intensely local, but it's hugely global, because their product they want to sell globally as well. It's high stakes for the distillery. This is a huge investment for them. But at the same time, it's exhilarating because they can produce a whole variety of whiskies there that most distilleries can't do. And of course, training and expertise is on the job. Compare that to legal education in your law school. Do we have that kind of vision for experimentation, for high stakes investment, as it were, in technologies, and above all in distillers, in people, experiments in legal education? I think this is a great example for us to think about. But the sense of history is really important there, because that couldn't have taken place unless there were the dun, the castle, the stone moved to the buyers, and that taken over and made into the distillery itself. Final example, Portrait of the Teacher as an online outsider. Here we have a sim client talking to one of our students. The student is interviewing the sim client, and that interview is recorded and given to the students to reflect on. The sim clients also give feedback immediately after the interview to the student. This started in Scotland when we were dissatisfied with the performance of our tutors in assessing student performance. There was neither robustness nor validity, very little reliability as well. And as a result of this correlative study that we did, we found out that, correlating the two, that our sim clients were way better than our tutors at assessing the students. We also discovered that the students were pretty atrocious at self-assessing themselves. Some students thought they did a great job and it was awful, and vice versa. So we did a lot of work there for us in actually teaching the students about the standards that we wanted as well. That all came about because we trusted our ability to train lay people, simulated clients, in order to do that. And we made what the client thinks important as the most salient for the students. That was really important. And the students absolutely loved it. And as a result, we went, those of us who were involved in this at Strathclyde, we went global with this. And these are the projects that we have on, I don't know whether some of them are still going, but this is where we seeded projects, as it were. Great work being done in Hong Kong, for example, and of course, Ireland too. It's ongoing in Canada and also in England too. In Canada, in Osgoode Hall Law School, we have 300 students in our first year, and they go through the whole process of interviewing the clients in a course called legal process. We also have lawyers involved here in Osgood Professional Development, and they love it too, because they're getting immediate feedback from the SIM clients on how they did in interviewing as lawyers in family law, and also in a module called Advanced Workplace Investigations. And we did a study on whether students would want us to continue with face-to-face post-COVID, or to keep the online that we had over the COVID process. Really interesting results, which are reported on last year and which we're finalizing this year. The quantitative results favored face-to-face over online. But when you actually drilled into, and we put the comments into a coding frame, and we analyzed those results, there were many more positive experiences that the students reported from online rather than face-to-face. Excellent student feedback, as always, in every place. And in addition, we also developed this for professional learning, based in CPLED, the Centre for Professional Legal Education, based in Calgary, in Alberta. Also drew in Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Nova Scotia over there. So these 4 law societies were effectively coming together to, in this course called PrEP, for their articled students who are in offices. So we're talking about 1,000 students over a huge area, you know, substantial size of Europe, portion of Europe is involved in that expanse. Again, online worked really well there. Online interviews worked really well there. The whole project about SIM clients in many respects challenges us, particularly online, to rethink these sorts of things, curriculum methods, for example, there, number 7, the assumed primacy of face-to-face over online encounters. And there are lots and lots of discussion that we could have about this. But a couple of final points here. I want to leave at least some space for comments, questions, whatever at the end. Sustaining creativity, seeding it, developing it is one thing, but you know, how about sustaining creativity? Well, I think that there are maybe 7 ways in which we could do this. First of all, we've learned so much in COVID. COVID was a traumatic time for legal educators, as it was for our students. And in many respects, there's huge learning moments come out of that whole experience for us. And we ought to avoid what I call go-backery, you know. Oh God, you know, at last, face-to-face again, we can forget about COVID now. I don't think we can forget about COVID. You know, that pandemics are here to stay. They always have been. It's just that in the modern era, we haven't experienced so many of them. But if you think back to Zabarella, you know, he effectively was born into 1348 Black Death, you know, so he's born into the results of the Black Death there, which affected universities hugely, as it did the rest of medieval society. And so what we ought to be doing is rethinking what we are doing in legal education in so many ways. And I would say, rather controversially, that I think there's no such thing as experiential learning, because all learning is experiential. So bracketing off soft skills and all the rest of it just doesn't work, either for knowledge or the skills themselves. Excuse me, we really have to think about how learning is experiential for the student and us as we go through legal education. The material of learning spaces always affects learning processes. So if students are given a manuscript or a printed book or an online lecture or a webcast or whatever, they will learn different things, even though the text may be exactly the same. So the context of learning is really important there. And the context of assessment is too. Too often we go for snapshot assessment, even in COVID times, when, you know, we have online examinations and such like. I think we should be aiming much more for replay, remix, feed forward. assessment cultures rather than snapshots. There is no spoon. Yochai Benkler wrote a wonderful book called The Wealth of Networks, riffing off Adam Smith, The Wealth of Nations. And that book examines the whole concept of what exactly relationships in technology mean for the use of technology. And I would argue, much as the glossators used protocols, and we use protocols these days, curriculum itself is a technology. It has a timetable. We use digital tools. We use all sorts of all manner of tools to engage with the curriculum. It's a really powerful technology, and we ought to not to be controlled by the curriculum, but so much of our legal education is controlled by curriculum. It's driven by it, and I think that we have to be really careful to resist that. Legal education, as I said at the start, Peter Goodrich, remember the quote from him, is jurisprudential thinking made manifest. So legal education, an uneasy kind of thing, even the two words, law and education coming together, I don't think it is uneasy at all. It's part of jurisprudence. That's how we should think of it. And ethics and aesthetics, above all, are inseparable. We want tools that are a pleasure to use for our students and also for us as well, rather than kind of bodging and mixing and matching the various kind of stuff that we use in our law schools in order to assess students online and all the rest of it. This was put really well by Margaret Hagan from Stanford U Law School, whose beautiful graphic here expresses it exactly. The user experience should be at the center of all those things there. And by the user experience, I mean the experience of students in medieval times, in Renaissance, book times, and nowadays as well. And that should be, as she says, woven through an entire venture. Okay, one or two more slides and then I shall finish. This is ending on a personal note. This is my last BILETA. I thought the last one was going to be the last, but this is it. I've been chair on the exec. It's been a thrilling time. I think I've attended 17 conferences or given papers at 17 BILETAs. So it's time for this fizzy old dog to slope off into the blue yonder. I think as a organization, BILETA is really unique. We got some sense of that through Lee's words earlier about Yun Bing and the part that he played in technology and also legal pedagogy as well. And I would say to you, especially to younger members of academia coming into BILETA, be active beyond just giving and critiquing papers. And that means, for example, collegiality, which BILETA is famous for. Collaboration is essential to BILETA. It's the lifeblood of BILETA in so many ways. And I think we could do with more academic apparatus, a book series, for example, more workshops. We do workshops and seminars. We could do with probably more of that as well. How about what I was talking about earlier, research summaries? Abby has done an excellent job, for example, in policy statements and BILETA and so on. But I think that we should be summarizing the research in our fields for policymakers in much the same way that NHS policymakers and government and elsewhere rely heavily on summaries of research that are produced by the medical education or the medical establishment in teaching hospitals, for example. And we could do with more links with the professions, with academic. We sometimes see ourselves as academics and that's it. We could be linking with BIAL, British and Irish Association of Law Librarians, ALT, that's the Association of Learning Technologists, as well as ALT, and also CALI, our sister body in the state, with the inspirational John Mayer at the helm there. It's a wonderful organization doing great work, and we should be kind of linking up there. I had hoped to have a conference in Canada. COVID put paid to that. but we should be going elsewhere as well. Not every year, of course, but occasionally we could be linking up, for example, with others who are doing great work elsewhere. Here are the references, folks, and here are my contact details. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks very much for listening.
Well, thank you so very, very much for your inspiring words and for obviously all your previous service. I have lots of scribbles and questions, but that doesn't really matter. I think we have some time. James isn't scanning at me too much. I think we have 5 minutes if anyone would like to answer any questions or challenge or raise points. We do have just a couple of things on the chat. Let me just double check. Lots of thanks. We do have a couple of substantive questions. Excellent. So I will pick those up shortly. On BILETA, couldn't agree more. We have plans. We have more plans. Some of those will be shared in the closing session, so do come. Some prizes will be awarded, but also just a very valuable reminder and prod. So thank you so very, very much for that, Paul. From Andrew Cormack, a long-standing friend from JISC, with whom we have done a lot of different work, but which doesn't remove the need to do the work that you're talking about, says contractually required to mention Sarah Knight's work on the future of assessment and feedback.
Yeah, could I just say,
Please.
Andrew, I totally agree with that. In fact, I worked with Sarah on a simulation project called Simple. She was quite inspirational in that, and also in a lot of other work in supporting us when we were doing simulation work about 12 years or so, I think, ago now. So yeah, totally agree.
Fantastic. I'm just going to run down the chat, but here in the room, do get your hand ready as well. From ISOM, thank you. Excellent presentation. You're right, after COVID, we cannot go back and pretend nothing happened. The question is, whilst using online technologies, how can we make sure students are not isolated and create a feeling of community? I think that's perhaps something we can all identify with. Any thoughts you have on that, Paul, and anyone else, please?
Yeah, a couple of quick points there. Thanks, Alison. That's a great point. And maybe some others can, in the room here, maybe online, can chip into this as well. When I was at ANU, one of the courses that we put together was a kind of like a world first. It was an entirely online program, which was a GAD, so the American style of degree, law degree, and it was in Australian law rather than US or whatever, and it was by problem-based learning. And so we took a huge amount of learnings from medical education, how problem-based learning should be run, particularly online. And we discovered that having small groups and, face-to-face, for example, our sister body, University of York in England, not York University in Ontario, they've been running PBL for years now, but largely face-to-face. But we were doing it online, and that was really interesting. Because we found that the students working in small groups and coming together in larger groups, because they were working, as it were, experientially with each other online, researching law, and that we were giving them not just the materials, as it were, for online learning to learn law, but the opportunities to actually work away at researching and producing their own work. We found that was really helpful for building community online, especially as Australia is a vast place. And so we were drawing students from all over Australia. In fact, one of our students went to change job and went to Madrid and still was on the course and was able to liaise with this small PBL group and loved it, absolutely loved it. The students love that kind of sense of working together really intensely, as it were, and supporting each other too. So giving students the opportunity to do that is, I think, key. Anybody else got any ideas?
Gavin, and then we have a question from Chris, and then we'll go back to chat. Gavin.
Comments on the political angle, specifically coming from an institution where there's heavy centralization, we're being pushed to use this stuff, to use more technology, not for any pedagogical reasons, but because it's there. And there's been a real erosion of academic freedom in that I have colleagues now being told, you're not allowed to run a traditional exam because it costs too much. You've got to do it online. So how do we, and particularly BILETA, help to steer this conversation, still facilitates academic freedom, that lets us use this where it suits our pedagogical model rather than being pressured to do it purely because money?
Excuse me, really good point. Excuse me.
I wonder if Paul will be picked up, but he's away from the microphone.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Really good point, Gavin. Thanks very much. I would say there are a number of things we can do. First of all, with the Sim Client project, it was absolutely invaluable that we collected student feedback. So trying to persuade our colleagues anywhere in the world, we got to have feedback there from the students that shows this works as a creative enterprise. And when faculty see the amount of feedback there that is hugely positive, then they begin to think, yeah, this is really persuasive. Maybe we should be doing more of that. And that means that management become much more open to the whole concept, because you're going to have management on your side if you're going to be resisting the pressure and the pull of centralized apps, what I call vanilla apps, which are out there to be used by the entire university. I can't think of anything more mad, as it were, than having an app for the entire university, because our disciplines are so different. You know, chemistry, mathematics, physics, engineering, fine art, history, sociology, law, medicine. You know, how can you have an app which is the same, as it were, as all for all those varieties of disciplines? It just does not make sense to me. So we've got to be able to have pressure coming from the students, as it were, to persuade management. And once we have management, as it were, and I've found this in a whole range of institutions in Australia and Canada, and also in England, and certainly in Scotland, then we can begin to kind of clear that space, as it were, where we can do really interesting and good creative work with each other, and also with students. Also, I would argue, collaboratively, working together across institutions is really important. So if I see that Gavin, for example, is doing great work with his students there, that's something that will persuade managers in my institution. And they'll look at that and say, yeah, okay, well, if it works there, it could work here. Let's try it, you know?
Well, I'm going to stop just because time is ticking. Fantastic. And also, apologize, I didn't summarize the question, but I think you more than adequately brought out the question in your answer. Chris, please. And then James, I'm looking for a scowl or a wave or whatever. So Chris, please.
So I'll try and make it really quick. I'm so distracted by Sky, and I'm so glad that you've been on Sky for hopefully most of the pandemic, because you've obviously not had such an awful pandemic at some of us. Two things. The first thing, I obviously amazing presentation. I love the fact that you referred to mis and disrememberings. And for those of us interested in disinformation, not misinformation, I think that's a really useful thing to recall from the dim and distant past. And I agree with Gavin that this is the worst possible time in history to have a bunch of hooligans running British universities at a time when they're trying to move us online. And of course, the reason for a centralized app is because they centralize everything and because they don't care about the pedagogical outcomes. But I wanted to ask you about what you said, and I would have asked Abdul Palawala if Abdul was here, because the fact that we lost that progress in the 90s and even almost the repository of knowledge in the 90s, is this because, I mean, I vaguely remember, you know, I was a newish academic at the time, we just assumed that the electronic law journals project and funding for these things would carry on. And when the rug was pulled, because Elsevier had to make money, amongst other things, we just lost that repository of knowledge, even on a hard drive at that time. Is that what happened? Because when you just said it's your last BILETA, well, I better ask him now, so we don't lose it. Is that sort of what happened?
Paul, do you want to come up? And I'm sure in answering you will summarize the question
very quickly, because I know we're short of time. You're right, and this is one of the reasons why I'm saying that we have to stop that hemorrhaging of data, information, and memories as well, because I'm okay with interpretations and reinterpretation, but there's zero interpretations of the past because we've forgotten it entirely. So in a sense, looking at that one moment, for example, the disappearance of UK CLE, the UK Centre for Legal Education based at Warwick, which was a fascinating collection of resources. And indeed, they were putting together online great scholarly resources for legal education when, as you say, the rug was pulled from under them by the government. What was really interesting was that nobody stepped up at that point in law schools to say, yeah, we'll take care of that. We'll take care of this website. We'll keep it going. I think there was some bitterness, certainly in staff at Warwick, that, you know, that all of their good work just basically disappeared. And it's the same with the literature review for Letter. That is disappearing as well, you know. So I think we have ourselves to blame in some respect, because unlike the medics, we are not organising ourselves in the way that we could be organising ourselves, partly because, you know, the ref doesn't give brownie points for that kind of activity, you know, but it's just good housekeeping that enables much better, more sophisticated research to be produced on the raft, as it were, of other people's good work, in the same way as glossators worked on each other's shoulders all the time, you know.
It's not defined as impact by the ref.
Sorry?
It's not defined as impact by the ref.
We can unpick that later. Thank you, everyone. We have, I think, now been 8-minute coffee break, if I have the right date. Paul, thank you, and thank you for your conversation. The conversation will continue physically for those of us who are here. Apologies, there are some points in the chat. Perhaps email round to some of us, and we can get them onto Paul to pick up later on. Thank you all. Fascinating session as ever, and do join again at 4:30 when there will be more fun and games after sessions and lunch. Thank you all.